Lecture 23. Are we rational? Studies of human reasoning indicate that, at least from one point of view, we make a lot of mistakes. We don't categorize objects according to proper sets. We don't employ algorithms in the process of judgment and decision making. We don't employ the proper strategies when testing hypotheses. And we make a lot of mistakes in conditional reasoning, reasoning about syllogisms. Now this isn't new. Aristotle noticed this when he was wandering around the Agora in ancient Athens 2,500 years ago, and it was observing the mistakes that people made in even simple reasoning tasks that led him to formulate the principles of logical reasoning to begin with. We know that there's a big difference between the prescriptions about reasoning that have been handed down to us since the time of Aristotle and what emerges from descriptive studies of how people actually reason in the ordinary course of everyday living. The question is, what do we make of these errors? To begin with, our failure to categorize objects in terms of proper sets, our reliance on judgment heuristics instead of algorithms, our biases in hypothesis testing, and our failures of conditional reasoning all seem to undermine the assumption that's popular in classical philosophy and, for that matter, early cognitive psychology as well, that the decision maker is logical and rational. According to the normative model of human judgment and decision making, that's been handed down to us by philosophers from the time of Aristotle, people should reason about events following normative principles of logic and probability. Their judgments, decisions, and choices should be based on a principle of rational self-interest. This means that they should optimize their choices, maximizing their gains and minimizing their losses. And they should try to optimize in the most efficient manner possible. This normative model is enshrined in traditional economic theory as the principle of rational choice, an idealized prescription of how judgments and decisions should be made. Here's a fuller statement of rational choice theory. First, rational choices are based on current assets, on what the decision maker has in hand at the time the decision is made. Second, rational choices are based on the possible consequences or possible outcomes of each choice. Where these possible consequences are uncertain, then these uncertain consequences should be evaluated by probability theory. In this way, rational choices are always adaptive because they take into account the probabilities and values associated with each possible consequence of a decision. Rational choice is a prescription for how people should think, how they should make decisions. Rational choice theory has its origins in the work of Jeremy Bentham, an 18th century philosopher, and was formalized by Johann von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern in the middle of the 20th century. It is such an intrinsic part of classical economic theory that this view of rational decision-making is sometimes labeled Homo economicus, economic man. Rational choice theory is a very powerful and persuasive prescription for how people ought to make decisions. But, as you might expect by now, people don't really work that way. Consider the following scenario. Two people decide to attend a concert by a prominent rock star. Person A buys a regular ticket for $75. Person B buys a ticket from a scalper for $200. Both tickets are non-refundable. They get to the concert and the concert is terrible. The star is lip-syncing. She's not lip-syncing in time to the music. She lip-syncs different songs than the rest of the band is playing. It's just awful. Comes time for the intermission, and the question is, which of these two people is most likely to leave the concert before it's finished? If you're like most people, you think that person A is much more likely to leave than person B. Person B is going to say something like, I paid $200 for these tickets. I'm staying for this concert. Here's a famous experiment by Tversky and Kahneman based on this kind of intuition. It's known as the lost tickets scenario. Two people have decided to see a play. The tickets cost $10. As person A approaches the ticket booth, he discovers that he's lost a $10 bill. And the question is, will person A still buy the ticket? Now consider person B, who actually buys a ticket but loses the ticket before he enters the theater. The question is, will he go back to the box office and buy another ticket? Jot down your intuitions before you go to the next slide. Will A still buy the ticket? And will B buy another ticket? Here are the actual results of the study. The overwhelming majority of subjects, more than 80%, thought that person A, who lost the $10 bill as he was approaching the ticket booth, would buy the ticket. By contrast, for person B, who lost the $10 ticket after buying it, a majority of subjects actually thought that he wouldn't go back and buy another ticket. This phenomenon is known as a preference reversal. What people prefer under one scenario is reversed, at least to some extent, under an alternative scenario. And if you think about it for a second, this shouldn't happen according to the principle of rational choice. Person A lost a $10 bill. Person B lost a $10 ticket. They've both lost $10. That $10 is gone, and it shouldn't play any role in the decision that people make about the future. Rational choices are based on the decision maker's current assets. What's past is past and shouldn't play any role in making a decision about the future. But it evidently does. Here's how this kind of scenario played out in a real-life context from a study by Hal Arkus and Catherine Bloomer. They made arrangements to do this experiment with the ticket office at the Ohio University Theater, which sold subscription tickets to the next academic year's theater season. The first 60 individuals who approached the ticket office to buy a season ticket were offered one of three different prices. 1/3 of the customers was sold their subscription for the regular price of $15. That's $15, by the way, for 10 performances, a really good deal. Another third of the customers was told that as part of a special promotion, they were going to get a discount of $2. So they paid $13 for their season's ticket. And the remaining third of the customers were told that as part of a special promotion, they were getting a very deep discount of $7, so that they only paid $8 for the entire set of season's tickets. Remember, there was random assignment of customers to conditions. And Arkus and Bloomer followed these 60 individuals the next year to see how they behaved when it came time to actually attend the theatrical performances for which they had paid. Remember, they're buying these tickets in the spring and the summer for performances to be held in the fall and the spring of the next academic year. Here are the results of the study. The season's tickets were for 10 performances, 5 in the fall and 5 in the spring. Arkus and Bloomer focused on the first half of the season because they figured that a lot of things could come up that might prevent people from going to performances in the second half. But people would more likely to have their plans in place for the first half. In fact, customers who paid full price for their subscription were much more likely to attend the events than those who had gotten the discount. And again, the point is that the price you paid for the tickets shouldn't determine whether you actually go or not. That price has been paid, that money is gone. But in fact, people who paid full price for their tickets were much more likely to attend the scheduled events than those who got a discount. In economics and decision making, this is known as the problem of sunk costs. What you've already invested has an inordinate influence on decisions you make in the future. And again, the problem with sunk costs is that they violate the principle of rational choice. Rational choices should be made on the basis of current assets, on what the decision maker has in hand right now. Sunk costs, they've already been incurred, they can't be recovered. And so they should be ignored. But they're not ignored. These sunk costs are part of the contextual frame in which decision making occurs, and they can have a profound influence on the decisions that we make. Sunk costs commonly influence decision making in the realms of public policy. I went to college in the Vietnam War, and in the debates over the Vietnam War, it was very common to hear people say that X number of lives had already been lost, X number of dollars had already been spent. It was critical not to let those lives or those dollars go to waste, so we should send more troops to Vietnam and spend more money on the war. But whatever your view of the Vietnam War, the number of lives that had already been lost, the amount of money already spent, should have absolutely no bearing on whether we commit more troops or more money. More recently, we've heard the same kind of arguments used in support of increasing troops in the war in Iraq or in Afghanistan. And again, it doesn't matter what your position is on these wars. You can think they're a good thing or you can think they're a bad thing. But from the point of view of rational choice, sunk costs are a bad basis for decision making. Here's an example from domestic policy. The congressional debate over the Tennessee Tombigbee Waterway project in the 1980s. The Tennessee Tombigbee Waterway project was perhaps the largest waterway project in all of history, connecting two important rivers and allowing barge traffic to go from the midsection of the United States to the Gulf of Mexico. It was originally estimated to cost about $323 million in 1970 when the project was begun. But as so often happens, the project was plagued by delays and cost overruns and became known as a classic example of pork barrel spending in Congress. In 1981, after $1.1 billion had already been spent on a project originally estimated to cost $323 million, there was a serious proposal to abandon the project. And congressional representatives from the states involved, both Republican and Democrat, argued that to terminate the project before it was completed would be an unconscionable waste of public money. So much money had been spent, the project just had to be completed. In the end, the project was completed at a cost of about $2 billion, a 600% cost overrun, almost 600%. And the fact of the matter is that commercial barge traffic on the waterway never approached what had been projected. Its proponents argued that once the waterway was opened, it would float about 27 million tons of cargo in just its first year of operation. But in fact, cargo traffic on the Tenn-Tom waterway has never exceeded more than about 8 million tons. Whether that reduced tonnage is enough economic benefit to justify the expense of the construction of the Tenn-Tom waterway, that's an important question. But the worst reason to continue construction of a project, or to continue any project at all, is that you've already spent a great deal of money on it. Those expenditures are in the past. That money's gone. Rational choices are made based on the decision maker's current assets. Sunk costs are just one of many ways in which people routinely violate the prescriptions of rational choice theory of decision making. For example, sometimes we simply make our choices out of habit without thinking about the outcomes or the probabilities associated with them. Or we choose on the basis of conformity, choose things for ourselves just because other people favor them. Or we base our choices on authorities, on what congresspeople or priests or teachers or parents want us to do. These are all violations of rational choice because rational choices should be made on the basis of the outcomes for the decision maker and the probabilities attached to those outcomes. Any other basis for choosing is simply irrational. Okay, point taken, but if you think about it for a second, that's not a completely fair critique of human rationality. It's one thing to say we should rely on judgment algorithms, the calculation of values and probabilities, when the problems that we're confronted with are very well defined. But all too often we have to make judgments under conditions of uncertainty. Perhaps the problem itself is ill-defined. There are lots of different representations and therefore lots of different solutions. Or maybe there is an algorithm that would allow us to solve the problem, but we just don't know what it is. Or we know what the algorithm is, and we don't have enough information to apply the algorithm. Or we don't have the time to apply the algorithm. Or, let's be blunt here, sometimes we just don't have the motivation. All of these conditions, separately and together, create an environment of uncertainty in which the rules of decision-making may be very different from the prescriptions of rational choice theory. And when we look at how people make decisions under conditions of uncertainty, we get a very different picture of the human decision-making process than is offered by the theory of rational choice. Preference reversals and other apparent violations of rational choice occur because in decision-making, people do not simply calculate values and probabilities. Instead, they focus their attention on certain aspects of a choice rather than others, and this attentional focus can be shifted depending on how the problem is framed. And it turns out that framing also affects other aspects of judgment and decision-making. For example, the way a problem is framed may provide the initial value used in the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, or it may shape the choices made in hypothesis testing. A great deal of attention has focused on the role of framing in judgments concerning risky prospects, as in what's known as the disease problem. Imagine that you're a public health official facing the impending outbreak of a deadly disease. As I'm making these lectures right now, the world is faced with an epidemic of H1N1 flu virus or swine flu. Based on past experience, this imaginary disease is expected to kill 600 people. And you have two alternative programs available. Here are your choices. If program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. This is judgment under certainty. If you adopt A, you know for sure that 200 people will be saved. But program B entails risky prospects. If program B is adopted, there's a 1 in 3 chance that all will be saved, but a 2 in 3 chance that none will be saved. So now, if you're a public health officer faced with these choices, which program do you choose? Just note your choice before you go on to the next slide. When Tversky and Kahneman posed this question to actual subjects, they found that people overwhelmingly preferred the certain prospects of program A over the risky prospects of program B. Note that while A entails the certainty that some lives would be saved, B entails risky prospects. All might be saved, but all might die. Faced with this choice, people prefer program A to program B by a ratio of about 2 to 1. However, this preference violates the precepts of rational choice theory. Remember how we're supposed to evaluate choices according to rational choice theory. The expected value of a choice is equal to the expected outcome of the choice times the probability attached to that outcome. Accordingly, the expected value of program A, where it is certain that 200 lives will be saved, is 200 times 1, or 200. And the expected value of program B, where there's a chance that all 600 lives will be saved, is 600 times 1/3, or 200. So viewed from the perspective of rational choice theory, the outcomes of the two choices, the expected outcomes, are precisely identical. Now we can explain this pattern of choices with just one single additional assumption, which is that people are generally risk averse. People prefer a sure thing to any risk. Program A, where it's certain that 200 lives will be saved, 200 lives saved is a sure thing, is preferable to program B, where there's a chance that all the lives will be saved, but there's also a chance that all the lives will be lost. So the 2-to-1 preference for program A over program B might just be a simple case of risk aversion and not really much of a threat to rational choice theory. But it turns out that people are not necessarily risk averse. There are some circumstances under which they'll accept risks as opposed to a sure thing. Consider another pair of choices in the context of the disease problem. Remember, based on past experience, this disease is expected to kill 600 people. Now, as a public health officer, you have a choice of two other alternative programs. If program C is adopted, 400 people will die for sure. Those are certain prospects. 400 people will die. But if program D is adopted, there is a 1 in 3 probability that none will die and a 2 out of 3 probability that all will die. Here we have risky prospects. Faced with a choice between program C and program D, which program do you choose? Here's what Tversky and Kahneman found when they presented subjects with this pair of choices. Remember, program C entails the certainty that some lives will be lost. But program D entails risky prospects. All might be lost, but there's also a chance that none might be lost. Which program do you choose? Faced with this choice, people prefer program D to program C by a ratio of about 2-to-1. They prefer the risky prospects to the certain prospects. Needless to say, this preference is also irrational from the perspective of rational choice theory. Remember, we calculate the expected value of a choice in terms of the outcome of that choice multiplied by the probability attached to that outcome. So in program C, where it's certain that 400 people will die, the value of the choice is 400 times 1, or 400. With program D, where there's a chance that all will die, but only a chance, the value of that choice is the outcome, 600 deaths, times the probability attached to that outcome, 2 out of 3, or 400. Viewed rationally then, the outcomes of these two choices are identical. Viewed from the perspective of rational choice theory, the outcomes of these choices between C and D are identical, but in fact, all 4 programs are normatively equivalent. In each case, we can expect to save 200 lives and lose 400 lives. But they're clearly not psychologically equivalent. There is a clear preference reversal. When the choice is stated in terms of lives to be saved, people prefer certainty over risk. But when the choice is stated in terms of lives to be lost, people prefer risk over certainty. According to Tversky and Kahneman, programs A and B focus on gains, people's lives to be saved. Under such circumstances, people prefer a sure gain and are averse to risk. But programs C and D focus on losses, people who will die. Under these circumstances, people prefer to avoid a sure loss and are willing to accept some element of risk. People are not always risk averse. Something different, something more interesting seems to be going on. The first thing that framing effects tell us is that people's judgment is not invariant over different descriptions of a problem. How people will decide what choices they'll make depends on how the problem is framed, how the problem is worded. Again, as with sunk costs, framing effects violate normative rationality because a rational choice is determined by an abstract representation of the problem. The calculation of values is really just a matter of algebra. It's x times y, and it doesn't matter whether y is framed in terms of lives gained or lives lost or anything else. So our judgment should not depend on the wording of a problem, but it clearly does. Now, before we go any further, let's take a step back for a minute and look at the evolution of rational choice theory in neoclassical economics. According to expected value theory, people choose the option that has the highest value, usually expressed in terms of monetary gains and losses. Behavior is always represented as a choice between at least two options. There might be more options. And the value of each option is calculated as the outcome of that choice multiplied by the probability attached to that outcome. For example, consider a person who's offered a choice between two gambles. In gamble A, he has a 1 in 3 chance of winning $75. The expected value of this gamble is $75 times 1/3 or $25. In gamble B, the person has a 1 in 2 chance of winning $40. The expected value of this gamble is $40 times 1/2 or $20. According to expected value theory, a rational decision maker should choose the option which affords the greatest gain, or alternatively, the least loss. In this case, the decision maker would choose option A, the 1 in 3 chance of winning $75. This is because gamble A has the highest expected value. Expected value theory offers a kind of algorithm for making decisions and choices. If you want to know which choice to make, you calculate the expected values and you choose the option that affords the highest gain or the least loss. The problem is that people's behavior routinely violates simple expected value theory. The clearest example is a lottery. If you imagine that you buy a lottery ticket for $1 and you have a 1 in a million chance of winning $1 million. It follows that the expected value of that gamble is $1. It's an even break. But most lotteries have much worse odds than that, meaning that people buy lottery tickets where the expected value of the gamble is actually less than the amount they're betting. Betting on a lottery is completely irrational. So why do people do it? Well, for most people, $1 has relatively little value, and they think that it's worth investing for a chance, however small, to make a big gain. This is not bad reasoning, but again, it's completely irrational from the point of view of rational choice theory. If you behaved rationally, you would never buy a lottery ticket. Or, to return to our example in the previous slide, consider the choice between a 1 in 3 chance of winning $75 versus a 1 in 2 chance of winning $40. Rational choice theory dictates that we should take the 1 in 3 chance as opposed to the 1 in 2 chance because it's got the highest expected value attached to it. But many people will choose the 1 in 2 chance over the 1 in 3 chance, despite the fact that that gamble has the lower expected value, because with a 1 in 2 chance, they've got a better chance of winning something. In the context of gains, people are risk averse and they prefer a sure thing, and 1 out of 2 odds are a lot closer to a sure thing than 1 out of 3 odds are. Now, that choice is normatively irrational from the perspective of expected value theory, but it's not clear that it's irrational. Let's put it another way. Suppose a person is offered a choice between these two gambles, but all he needs is $10 to go to the movies. The bet with the smaller expected value, in fact, has the greater utility because he only needs $10, and the bet with the smaller value actually maximizes the likelihood that he's going to get the $10 that he needs. The bet with the larger value has surplus value, but no greater utility, and so you might say it's just not worth the risk. But if that same person needed $30 to buy some medicine for a sick cat, the riskier gamble might actually be more attractive, because if he wins, he's closer to the amount of money he needs. It has greater utility. Utilities can't be described objectively. They're subjective. They're idiosyncratic to the individual decision maker. Choice is not simply a matter of a blind calculation of values, but rather an individual's choices can only be understood by taking into account the circumstances of the individual decision maker, what his or her goals are, what his or her motives are. The problems attending what might be thought of as a very naive version of rational choice theory were addressed by a more psychologically sophisticated version known as expected utility theory. According to expected utility theory, decisions are based on a choice among utilities, not among values. Utilities, in turn, are described in terms of personal value, which may be different from the monetary value. Utility theory begins by calculating the value of a choice in the same way that expected value theory does, by taking the value of the outcome and multiplying it by the probability attached to that outcome. But after calculating the objective value of a choice, it then goes on to consider some of the properties of the decision maker, him or herself. For example, it assumes that people are largely risk averse, and also takes into account the fact that different decision makers will have different assets and different personal preferences. A person who only needs a couple of bucks to go to the movies is going to make a different choice than a person who wants to accumulate as much money as possible. And a person who needs a fair amount of money for medicine may be prepared to take some risk in order to get it. Expected utility theory is a real advance over naive expected value theory precisely because it injects psychological considerations into the process. For this reason, expected utility theory is sometimes known as subjective utility theory or subjective expected utility theory. Utility theory has its origins in the work of the Swiss mathematician Daniel Bernoulli in the 18th century, and achieved its quantitative formulation in the work of von Neumann and Morgenstern. Their version of rational choice theory really is a utility theory. But utility theory has its own problems. It has difficulty dealing with preference reversals, and it has difficulty dealing with framing effects. Exactly why it has these problems would take us beyond the scope of this course. Suffice it to say that utility theory basically asserts that utilities, once they've been determined, are going to remain constant, and they don't depend on the probabilities attached to various outcomes. In order to deal with the problems that confront subjective utility theory, Kahneman and Tversky have proposed a psychological alternative known as prospect theory. Prospect theory begins, as utility theory does, with the assumption that people base decisions on subjective utilities, not on the objective values associated with their choices. But prospect theory goes on to really take into account the psychology of the individual decision maker. In this way, they seek to explain a number of phenomena of decision making that are anomalous from the point of view of expected value theory and expected utility theory. For example, the fact that losses loom larger than gains, or that first impressions can shape final judgments. Remember the anchoring and adjustment heuristic? Or that vivid examples can overshadow statistical summaries. Remember the representativeness heuristic. Prospect theory is always concerned with how people make judgments, decisions, and choices under conditions of risk. That is, where outcomes are to a greater or lesser extent uncertain. The basic idea of prospect theory is that such judgments are not made merely by the kinds of calculations envisioned by the doctrine of human normative rationality, the theory of rational choice. Rather, they are greatly influenced by how problems and outcomes are framed. That's where prospect theory gets its name. Prospect theory emphasizes how judgments, decisions, and choices are framed, how they appear to the person making them, how the problem is perceived. It's kind of the other side of the coin from the constructivist view of perception. In the constructivist view, perception involves judgment and decision-making. In prospect theory, judgment and decision-making depend on perception. In some sense, prospect theory is a modification of utility theory because it shares with utility theory the assumption that people base their decisions on subjective utilities, not objective values. But unlike utility theory, it does not assume that people are always risk-averse. People prefer sure gains when their attention is focused on gains, but they prefer to take a risk when their attention is focused on loss. And attention is focused by the way the choice is worded, resulting in framing effects. Furthermore, in calculating the utility of a choice, people do not simply multiply utilities by the objective probability attached to them. Rather, they employ a psychological concept of probability, which tends to overweight very high and very low probabilities. Thus, probable but not certain gains look better, and probable but not certain losses look worse than they really are. And this is especially true for very high and very low risks. And in addition, people do not evaluate utilities in an absolute sense either. Rather, the evaluation occurs against the background provided by some reference point, such as the 600 lives that are projected to be lost in the disease problem. Framing, a focus on lives saved or lives lost, alters this subjective reference point. The result, again, is to make risky prospects look better or worse than they really are. In injecting psychological considerations into economic theory and into the theory of rational choice, von Neumann and Morgenstern made an important first step with their subjective utility theory. But Kahneman and Tversky's work on prospect theory continues that tradition and really advances it a long way. While rational choice is an idealized prescription for how economic decision makers ought to behave, prospect theory is an empirically based description of how people actually make judgments and decisions in real-world contexts. In 2002, in an event long anticipated by his colleagues, Daniel Kahneman received the Nobel Prize in Economics, sharing the award with Vernon Smith of George Mason University. Amos Tversky, having died several years earlier, was not eligible to share the award, but in his press statements, Kahneman clearly acknowledged his collaboration with Tversky. At first glance, prospect theory appears to violate the assumptions of normative rationality, the idea that decision makers are rational, they optimize utilities, they intuitively understand and apply statistical principles and the principles of logical reasoning. And, in fact, the kinds of departures from normative rationality that lay the foundation for prospect theory have been taken by some psychologists as grounds for what I have come to call the people are stupid school of psychology. The fundamental assumption of this group of psychologists is that people are indeed fundamentally irrational. They don't think very hard about anything. They let their emotions and motives get in the way of their cognition. These psychologists also believe that people usually operate on automatic pilot, meaning that we don't pay too much attention to what is going on, so that we're swayed by first impressions and our immediate responses. Our behavior is mostly unconscious, and our reasons little more than post hoc rationalizations for our behavior. From the perspective of this group of psychologists, consciousness is not necessarily a good thing, and it can actually get in the way of adaptive behavior. But do the kinds of effects documented here, the kinds of effects that led Kahneman and Tversky to propose prospect theory in the first place, really support the conclusion that human beings are fundamentally irrational? Not necessarily. In the first place, remember that normative rationality is an idealized description of human thought, a set of prescriptive rules about how people ought to make judgments and decisions under ideal circumstances. But circumstances are not always ideal. It may very well be that most of our judgments are made under conditions of uncertainty, and most of the problems we encounter are ill-defined. And even when they're not, all the information we need may not be available, or it may be too uneconomical to obtain it. Under these circumstances, departures from normative rationality seem like a good idea. They allow fairly adaptive judgments to be made. Yes, perhaps we should appreciate more how they can mislead us, and yes, perhaps we should try harder to apply algorithms when they're applicable, but in the final analysis, it seems rational to inject economies into decision-making, as long as you're willing to pay the price of making a mistake. So human beings are rational after all, it seems. The problem, noted by William Simon, is that human rationality is bounded. We have a limited capacity for processing information, which prevents us from attending to all the relevant information and from performing complex calculations in our heads. We live with these limitations. They come with our information processing equipment. They come with our cognitive faculties. But within these limitations, we do the best we can with what we've got. Simon argued that we can improve human decision-making by taking account of these limits and by understanding the liabilities attached to various judgment heuristics and other shortcuts. But there's no escaping judgment heuristics because there's no escaping judgment under uncertainty, and there's no escaping the limitations on human cognitive capacity. In a very real sense, Kahneman and Tversky's work on prospect theory is an extension of Simon's earlier work on bounded rationality. And in fact, Simon was the very first psychologist to receive the Nobel Prize in economics in 1978 for his work on decision-making processes in economic organizations, which is where he began to document departures from normative rationality and began to develop the theory of bounded rationality. In fact, Simon introduced the whole notion of judgment under uncertainty and substituted the goal of satisficing for optimizing in theories of judgment and decision-making. In the process, he articulated a wholly new and more psychologically realistic concept of human rationality that laid the foundation for the work of Kahneman, Tversky, and others like them. Contrary to the precepts of normative rationality, Simon observed that neither people nor organizations necessarily insist on making optimal choices, that is, always choosing that single option that most maximizes gains and most minimizes losses. Rather, Simon showed that organizations evaluate all the alternatives available to them and then identify those options whose outcomes are satisfactory, hence the term satisficing. The choice among these satisfactory outcomes may be arbitrary, or it may be based on non-economic considerations. But it is rarely is the optimal choice because the organization focuses on satisficing, not optimizing. Satisficing often governs job assignments and personnel selection. You don't necessarily want to select the person with the very highest test score for a particular job because that person might be overqualified for that particular job, in that they may have skills that are way beyond what is needed for the job they're going to perform. So organizations and individuals don't optimize. Rather, they satisfice. They try to identify satisfactory outcomes, and then among the set of satisfactory outcomes, they choose among them more or less arbitrarily. Once you've identified a satisfactory outcome, Simon asserts, it's rational to choose it. There's no need to expend more time and energy and expense trying to find the very best. Bounded rationality, the rationality of real humans operating in real decision-making contexts, is based on what the German psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer has called fast and frugal heuristics. Far from being non-optimal approaches to problem-solving, judgment, and decision-making, Gigerenzer argues that in the real world, heuristics are often the best approach, precisely because so many of the problems we encounter are ill-defined, and so many of the algorithms that we could use to solve these problems are really uneconomical. Gigerenzer argues that it's rational to inject economies into decision-making so long as we're able to pay the price of making the occasional error, and that we can reduce the errors that we make by using judgment heuristics, both by understanding better than we do the normative principles that are in operation, and also by understanding better than we do the liabilities of various judgment heuristics. Humans live lives of uncertainty in a world that contains a host of ill-defined problems. There's no getting away from that. In such a world, we do the best we can, using a rationality that is bounded both by the conditions under which we have to decide and the information processing apparatus that we use to frame decisions and make choices. It may not be what Aristotle had in mind, but it's not irrational either, nor is it stupidity.